He returned to his father's ranch and found the woman whom the entire town wanted to destroy. However, what he did next changed everything. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The road to the ranch was longer than Andrew Colton remembered. It stretched like a thin, dusty ribbon over the parched hills, winding past stunted mesquite trees and the occasional cluster of cattle bones gone white in the sun. The horse he had borrowed from a man in town moved with a tired, steady gait, hooves stirring up small clouds of dust that hung in the hot air before settling back down. The sun had dipped low enough that the light turned everything the color of tarnished brass. Shadows stretched long across the ground, reaching for him as he rode. Andrew shifted in the saddle, feeling every mile in his back. It had been years since he had come this way, years since his mother had taken him away from this hard, wind-scoured piece of land and left his father to keep it alone. The telegram telling him of his father's death had arrived only 3 weeks ago, and now here he was, the last Colton left to claim what was his. As he topped the last rise, the ranch came into view, and Andrew slowed the horse to a walk. The house stood where it always had, but it looked smaller than in his memory, more hunched against the wind, as though the weight of the years had pressed it down into the earth. The roofline sagged in one corner, and the shutters rattled weakly against the siding. Weeds had taken over the front yard, growing high between the stones of the path. The corral fence leaned at odd angles, some rails split, others lying in the dirt as if kicked free by restless hooves. He dismounted slowly, his legs stiff, and led the horse toward the hitching post. The smell of the place struck him as soon as his boots touched the ground. Dry dust, sun-bleached wood, and something faintly sour, like old grain left too long in a sack. He stood a moment, reins in his hand, just looking at the house. It was quiet in a way that made his skin prickle. Not the peaceful quiet of a resting place, but the hollow quiet of somewhere abandoned. Inside, the air was cooler but heavy, as if it had not been stirred in months. Dust lay thick on the table and the shelves, though there were signs his father had lived here until the end. A coffee cup on the counter, a stack of letters near the bed, a worn coat thrown over a chair. The hearth was cold, a thin layer of ash in the grate. Andrew set his bag down and stood in the middle of the single room, taking it all in. He had expected to feel anger or grief, but what settled over him was something closer to unease. It was as if the house were waiting for him to do something, say something, fill the silence. He lit a lamp and began to walk through each part of the homestead, opening doors, checking the state of things. The pantry was nearly empty. The barn held only one old mule and a half-rotted stack of hay. Tools were scattered where they had been dropped. A hammer left on the porch. A bucket overturned near the well. The more Andrew saw, the clearer it became that his father had been struggling to keep this place going, working himself past reason, until war finally took him from it for good. When he came to the last building, the weathered old storage shed near the back of the yard, he almost turned away. The door was shut tight, a rusted padlock hanging from the latch. It took him several minutes to find a crowbar and force it open. The hinges groaned in protest as the door swung inward, releasing a wave of stale, damp air. Inside, it was dim, the single window too dirty to let in much light. At first, Andrew thought the sound he heard was an animal, a faint splash, like a hoof shifting in water. Then his eyes adjusted, and he saw the barrel in the corner, tall and wide, filled nearly to the brim. Something moved inside it. His stomach went cold. He stepped closer and saw hair, long and black, plastered to a face. A pair of eyes flashed up at him, wild and burning with fury. He stumbled back, his mind reeling. There was a person in there, a young woman, arms and legs bound, her chin barely above the waterline. She kicked once, the motion sending a ripple across the surface. Andrew cursed under his breath and dropped the crowbar. His hands shook as he grabbed the ropes and yanked her up, dragging her over the side of the barrel. Water poured off her, soaking the dirt floor, her dress clinging to her thin frame. She collapsed onto her knees, coughing, gasping for air like a half-drowned animal. Andrew fumbled for his knife and cut through the ropes. The marks on her wrists were angry and raw, her ankles red where the cords had bitten into them. She didn't thank him. She didn't even look at him at first. When she did, it was with a glare that made him take a step back. She was young, maybe his age or a little younger, her cheekbones sharp, her skin the deep bronze of the desert tribes. Her hair hung in wet ropes over her shoulders, her chest heaving. There was no plea in her expression, no fear even, just watchfulness and a kind of defiance, as though daring him to try and put her back in the barrel. Andrew felt a hollow ache open in his chest. His father had done this, the man who had taught him to ride, who had shown him how to mend a fence, who had stood like a wall of stone when his mother packed their things and left. That same man had kept this girl tied up like a piece of livestock. He found an old blanket on a shelf and tossed it toward her. She grabbed it quickly, pulling it around her shoulders, but stayed crouched where she was, water dripping down her legs and pooling at her feet. Andrew didn't try to speak. What could he possibly say? For a long time they stayed that way, the only sound the steady drip of water from her hair. Finally, Andrew backed toward the door, giving her space. He gestured toward the open yard. If she wanted to run, he wouldn't stop her. But she didn't move. She just stared, wary as a cornered coyote. By the time he left the shed, the sky had gone dark. Stars pricked the blackness overhead, and a cold wind slid down from the hills. Andrew went back inside the house and sat heavily at the table. He could still see her face in his mind, those eyes bright and unyielding. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The house creaked around him, and every sound made him sit up, half expecting to hear the door slam or the shed empty. But when dawn broke, pale and gray, he looked out the window and saw her still there, sitting on the ground near the barn, wrapped in the blanket like a sentinel. She hadn't run. Andrew pulled on his boots and stepped out into the chill morning air. The ranch felt different now, less empty, but heavier, as if he had inherited not just the land, but the burden of everything that had happened here. Whatever his father's reasons had been, they were now Andrew's to reckon with. Morning light spread slowly across the hard ground, washing the ranch in a pale glow that made every edge look sharper. Andrew stood on the porch, with his hands braced against the railing, staring out toward the barn where she still sat. The blanket was wrapped around her shoulders, and her face was turned toward the sunrise, expression unreadable. She had not moved far from where he had left her the night before. There was a steadiness to her presence that unsettled him more than if she had fled. She could have gone into the hills, vanished into the scrub before he woke, but she hadn't. It was as though she had decided, for reasons he could not guess, that this was where she would remain for now. Andrew went back inside, lit the stove, and worked mechanically to prepare coffee and a bit of breakfast from the meager stores left in the pantry. The bread was dry, the beans hard, but it was enough to keep him moving. When he carried a plate and cup outside, she turned her head slightly, watching him approach with the wariness of a wild animal. He set the food down on the porch step and walked away, standing near the hitching post until she decided whether to come closer. After a long moment, she rose, bare feet leaving damp prints on the packed earth, and took the plate. She crouched low to eat, keeping one eye on him, her movements quick and cautious, as if she half expected him to snatch the food back before she could finish. When the plate was empty, she set it down without a word and retreated a few steps. Andrew collected the tin dish and stood awkwardly for a moment. He felt a strange, heavy responsibility settling over him. She was no longer a secret hidden in a barrel. She was here, alive, and every decision he made now would shape what happened next. Inside the house, Andrew began searching through the things his father had left behind. He was looking for answers, though he wasn't sure what kind. In the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, beneath a stack of old shirts and a faded cavalry jacket, he found a packet of papers bound with twine. They were his father's journals, the handwriting rough but steady, the words pressed hard into the paper as though each had been carved there. He read by lamplight late into the afternoon, the shadows growing long across the floor. The first entries were about ordinary ranch, life fence repairs, cattle counts, weather reports. But then came the pages that stopped him, cold. His father had written about a skirmish near the reservation, about riding out with a patrol after a raid and finding a burned camp. Most of the tribe had been killed or scattered. He had found a single survivor hiding near the river, a young woman barely alive. He wrote of how he could not bring himself to hand her over to the men who would drag her to the fort, where punishment would be swift and cruel. Instead, he had brought her here, believing he was sparing her life. But as the entries went on, there was a darkness creeping into the words. His father had grown harsher, more desperate. He wrote of trying to make her work, of her refusal to speak to him, of nights he feared she would escape, and the soldiers would return, accusing him of harboring an enemy. The last pages were filled with contradictions, anger, regret, and something like pleading with himself. He had started to write that he meant to let her go, but each time the sentence broke off, unfinished. Andrew shut the journal and sat very still. The fire crackled softly in the stove, but the room felt colder than before. His father had believed he was doing right, but in the end, he had left a girl locked in a barrel of water like an animal. Whatever mercy he had intended had curdled into something else. Andrew pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes, trying to push back the image of her face as he had first seen it. The next days were filled with a strained routine. Andrew began to repair the broken fences, check the water troughs, and bring the house back into some kind of order. Each morning he left food where she could take it, and each evening he found her still near the barn or the porch, never venturing far, never speaking. Slowly, something began to shift. One afternoon, when he was hauling water from the well, he saw her standing a few yards away, watching him. Without a word, she came forward, took the second bucket, and carried it to the trough. It was the first time she had done anything willingly, and Andrew felt a knot in his chest loosen. By the end of that week, she had begun sweeping the dirt floor of the cabin, stacking wood near the hearth, and mending a broken stool with a strip of rawhide she had found in the shed. Her movements were efficient and silent, her eyes still sharp, but she no longer looked at him as though waiting for a blow. He noticed the way she kept her distance, never too close, never turning her back to him completely. But there was no open hostility now, only caution. The ranch itself began to look less abandoned. The corral was patched, the yard cleared of weeds. Smoke from the chimney rose straight into the sky in the evenings, a sign to anyone passing on the road that the Colton place was no longer empty. That thought brought a different kind of unease. Andrew knew that sooner or later someone from town would come asking questions. One afternoon, he heard the distant sound of a horse and stepped outside in time to see a rider passing along the far ridge. The man slowed, looking down toward the house, then spurred his horse and rode on. Andrew felt a prickle of foreboding crawl up his spine. By the next day, there were two riders, their figures silhouetted against the horizon for a few moments before they disappeared. Gossip traveled fast in small towns, and Andrew could almost hear the words forming in the mouths of the locals. that the younger Colton had returned, that he had taken up with an Apache girl, that trouble was brewing. That night, as he sat at the table mending a torn bridle strap, he saw her glance toward the window more than once, as though she had noticed the watchers too. The lamplight caught the line of her jaw, the set of her mouth. There was no fear there, only the same quiet tension he felt himself. She knew, as he did, that the world beyond the ranch would not let this be for long. Still, they kept working. The days took on a rhythm that was almost steady. He rose before dawn, lit the fire, left food for her, and went out to the pastures. When he returned, he would find some small sign that she had been at work too. A swept floor, fresh water in the basin, a few sticks stacked neatly by the door. At night, they ate in silence, the fire snapping between them, the air heavy with something that was not quite hostility, but not yet trust. Andrew caught himself watching her more often, noticing things he had not at first, the way her hands moved quickly when she worked, the way she pushed her hair back behind her ear when it fell across her face. He felt no right to ask about her past, but sometimes, when she stood in the doorway, looking toward the dark hills, he wondered what she saw out there, what she had lost. As the weeks passed, the tension did not vanish, but it became something they shared rather than something that divided them. The house no longer felt entirely his, but it no longer felt as empty either. Each night, when he banked the fire and lay on the bed, he could hear the faint sound of her breathing from where she lay near the hearth. It was a strange comfort, knowing someone else was there, even if they barely spoke. But the peace was fragile, and Andrew knew it. The riders on the ridge were only the beginning. Somewhere in town, someone was already telling the story of the Colton place, and soon enough, someone would ride up the trail and demand answers. When that day came, Andrew would have to decide what kind of man he was going to be, one who gave in to fear, or one who stood his ground. The days that followed were colder, the sky a pale iron gray that pressed low over the hills. Andrew worked from dawn until the light failed, patching fences, hauling water, keeping the place running, and trying not to think too much about the distant riders who had passed on the ridge. He knew they would not stay distant forever. Every sound on the trail made him glance toward the horizon, waiting for the day when someone would ride straight into the yard. When it happened, it was just past midday, the sun hanging thin and cold overhead, the ground still hard with frost. Andrew was in the pasture checking the troughs when he heard the approach of more than one horse. He straightened slowly, brushing dust from his gloves, and walked toward the porch with a measured step. 3 men appeared out of the glare, their horses blowing steam into the winter air. 2 of them he recognized as neighboring ranchers, men who liked to drink too much and talk too loud at the trading post. The third was the deputy from town, his badge catching the weak light as he reined in at the gate. Andrew stopped on the porch, one hand resting on the post, and waited. The deputy's face was hard, the kind of look a man wore when he had come to deliver news no one wanted to hear. They asked their questions without dismounting. Word had spread, they said. Folks in town were talking. There was a woman here, an Apache, living under Andrew's roof. Some claimed she was a thief. Others whispered she had been part of the raids last spring. People wanted her brought in, wanted to see her judged or driven out. The ranchers spat their contempt into the dirt, their horses stamping as though to punctuate the words. Andrew listened in silence, his arms crossed against the wind. He felt the weight of their stares, felt the judgment in every word. It would have been easy to nod, to say she was nothing to him, to let them take her away and be done with it. He could have ended the trouble before it grew. But behind him, he knew she was standing just inside the cabin, watching. He could feel her presence like a second heartbeat. He told them no. His voice was quiet, but sharp enough to cut the air between them. She was here, he said, and she was safe. She worked for her keep. Whatever she had done before no longer mattered here. The words hung there, and for a moment no one moved. Then one of the ranchers cursed under his breath and shifted in the saddle. The deputy's jaw tightened, but he did not argue further. He said this would stir up trouble, and Andrew said, "Let it." The standoff stretched like a wire ready to snap, until finally the deputy gave a short nod and turned his horse. The other two followed, muttering as they went, leaving a trail of hoofprints in the frozen ground. Andrew stood there until the sound of hooves faded down the trail, then turned toward the house. She was in the doorway, her hands clenched at her sides, her face calm but watchful. He told her what had been said. She did not speak for a long moment, only lifted her chin, as though waiting for him to tell her she had to leave. Instead, he told her she was staying. Something in her shoulders eased then, and she gave a single, small nod before stepping back inside. That evening, the cabin was quiet, the kind of quiet that carried the memory of raised voices outside. Andrew ate at the table, and she sat near the fire, mending a shirt she had found in the chest. The lamplight caught the curve of her cheek as she worked, her fingers quick and precise. Every so often their eyes met, and neither of them looked away too quickly. When she finished her work, she folded the shirt neatly and set it aside, then sat a little closer to the fire than usual. Over the next few days, Andrew worked harder than ever, repairing the corral rails, splitting wood, keeping himself busy. She worked beside him, her presence steady, her movements quick and sure. When he handed her tools, her fingers brushed his once or twice, and she did not flinch. There was a strange comfort in their wordless rhythm. Two people filling the same space with effort instead of silence. One afternoon, while checking the line of fence at the far edge of the pasture, Andrew paused and looked back toward the house. Smoke was curling from the chimney, steady and gray against the pale sky. He imagined her inside, tending the fire, sweeping the floor, moving through the rooms as if they belonged to her as much as to him. The thought settled in his chest with a weight that was not unpleasant. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters until the whole cabin seemed to shake. She startled once when a loose board slammed against the wall, and Andrew got up to check the latch on the door. When he told her it was just the storm, she relaxed slightly, though her eyes stayed on him as he banked the fire. The warmth between them felt different that night, heavier somehow, as though the air itself had thickened. The next morning, he left her to tend the hearth while he rode out to check the stock. When he returned near dusk, the smell of beans cooking met him before he even reached the porch. She had taken it upon herself to cook without being told. When he stepped inside, she glanced up only briefly before returning to the pot, and he nodded his thanks. Evenings became softer after that. They sat by the fire, closer than before, sometimes working on separate tasks, sometimes just sitting in silence. Andrew found himself watching her more openly, noticing the way her hair gleamed in the firelight, the way her hands moved as she braided it before sleep. The distance between them was shrinking with every passing day, though neither of them spoke of it. One night, as the fire burned low, she drew her blanket nearer to the hearth, her knees pulled up, her face turned toward the flames. Andrew sat at the table with a whetstone, running it along the edge of his knife. The sound was soft, steady, filling the room like a heartbeat. After a long time, he set the knife down and asked her, quietly, if she missed her people. She looked at him for a long moment before answering. Yes, she said at last, but she was alive. The words settled something inside him, though they brought a sharp ache too. From then on, Their silences were different. They were no longer the silences of two strangers forced to share a space, but the silences of two people who had chosen, in some small way, to stay. When Andrew lay in bed at night, staring up at the rafters, he could hear the even sound of her breathing just beyond the fire, and it steadied him. By the end of that week, Andrew no longer wondered whether she might run while he was gone. He rode the fence line and returned to find her still there, the cabin warm, the floor swept, supper on the stove. It was a small thing, but it felt like the first true act of trust between them. That night, when the wind howled around the corners of the house and the fire popped in the hearth, Andrew sat by the flames instead of at the table. She was already there, her blanket around her shoulders. The air between them felt charged, as though the storm outside had stirred something in both of them. When her knee brushed his as she shifted closer to the fire, she froze, ready to pull away. But Andrew did not move. He told her quietly that she could sit on the bench if she wanted, and after a moment's hesitation she did, crossing the space between them with careful steps. She sat close enough that he could smell the faint, clean scent of soap on her skin, and they stayed like that for a long time, watching the flames. Without thinking too much about it, Andrew reached out and brushed a loose strand of hair back behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek, and she did not flinch. She turned her head slightly to meet his gaze, her eyes steady. No fear in them now, only something searching. His throat felt tight. For so long he had kept the world at a distance, but in that moment, the distance closed. When he leaned closer, he did it slowly, giving her time to move away if she wished. She didn't. Their first kiss was tentative, slow, a quiet breaking of the long silence between them. When they drew apart, she did not retreat, only sat, breathing a little faster, her dark eyes fixed on him. Andrew stood after a moment. Not trusting himself to sit so close any longer, he added another log to the fire, and she helped him place it on the coals. Then she lay down near the hearth, turning her face toward him as he crossed to the bed. He sat for a long while, watching the glow of the embers, before lying back. His heart still thudded hard in his chest, but it did not feel wrong. It felt as though something that had been out of place for years had finally shifted into alignment. Outside, the storm raged, wind screaming against the walls, but inside, the cabin was warm. Andrew closed his eyes, listening to the crackle of the fire and the sound of her breathing just beyond it, and for the first time since the war, the thought of tomorrow did not feel empty. The winter began to loosen its grip by slow degrees, as if reluctant to let go. Days stretched longer, the light softening until it painted the hills with a faint gold by afternoon. The air still held its bite, but the wind no longer cut so sharply, and the snow that had drifted high against the corral posts melted into thin gray ribbons that wound their way toward the creek bed. Andrew noticed the change one morning as he stood on the porch with his coffee, steam curling from the tin cup in the chill air. For months, the ranch had seemed locked in a hush of ice and frost, but now there was the faint smell of wet earth, of grass not yet green, but alive under the surface, waiting for its moment. It felt like a promise of something that had been missing too long. Inside, the house was warm, the fire already built high by the time Andrew returned from the yard. She had taken to rising early, sometimes before he did, tending the hearth until the cabin glowed with heat. He found her that morning standing near the stove, skirts brushing the freshly swept floor, her hair loose down her back as she stirred the pot. She glanced over her shoulder at him, and there was a calm in her expression that had not been there those first days. She had stopped flinching at every creak of the boards, stopped glancing toward the door, as though measuring the distance to escape. Breakfast passed in the quiet rhythm that had become theirs, broken only by the soft scrape of spoons against tin. When Andrew pushed back from the table, she rose too, as though it were understood that they would face the day's work together. Outside, the ground was still damp with melted snow. But he took a spade and began turning the soil in the patch of ground near the house where his father had once kept a garden. She joined him without being asked, kneeling to scatter the first seed along the row he had made. The sight of her working there, her hands dark with soil, the sun catching in her hair, made something tighten in his chest. When the row was finished, they stood together, looking down at the turned earth. It was a small thing, a single row in a wide, empty yard, but to Andrew it felt like the beginning of something larger. He brushed the dirt from his hands and met her gaze. She gave the smallest nod, as though to say that, yes, this was good. This was worth doing. They went back inside for coffee, and Andrew could not help noticing how different the house felt now compared to that first night. The floor no longer held the deep dust that had greeted him on his arrival. The curtains had been washed and stitched, the chairs mended, and there was a quilt folded neatly at the end of the bed that she had pieced together by hand during the long winter evenings. It was no longer just a place to keep out the wind. It was a home. The men who had come to challenge him never returned. Once, the deputy passed by on the trail, tipped his hat, and kept riding without stopping, and Andrew understood. That word had gone around, that there was no use pressing him further. He had made his choice clear, and the matter was settled as far as he was concerned. The relief was quiet, but it went deep. One bright afternoon, Andrew hitched the wagon and drove into town for lumber. She came with him, sitting close on the bench, her shawl drawn tight against the wind. People still looked when they arrived, heads turning, voices dropping as they passed. But the stares did not last as long as before. Inside the general store, Mrs. Blanchard greeted them with a nod and offered a bolt of fabric at a fair price. She accepted it without lowering her eyes, and Andrew felt something inside him uncoil. It was the first time he had seen anyone treat her like more than a scandal to be whispered about. They drove home with the fabric tucked carefully beside the sacks of nails and flour, and the road felt less lonely than it had before. The seasons continued their slow turn. Days grew warmer, the pastures softened underfoot, and the cattle moved lazily under the sun. One evening, after they had finished supper, she came to stand in front of him on the porch, where he sat sharpening his axe. She said nothing at first, just waited until he set the blade aside. Then she reached for his hand and placed it against her stomach. Andrew blinked, confused, until he understood what she was telling him. A strange mix of shock and something like joy rose sharp in his chest, and he had to take a slow breath to steady himself. He had not let himself imagine this, not after all he had lost before, but now he could see it clearly. The house with a cradle by the bed, the sound of small feet on the porch one day. The ranch carrying more than just his name. He stood then, pulling her against him and holding her as though afraid the moment might slip away. She leaned into him without resistance, her head resting beneath his chin, and for a long time they stood that way, the quiet around them filled only by the soft chorus of night sounds, the lowing of cattle in the pasture, the whisper of wind in the dry grass. That night, they sat together on the porch until the sky turned from gold to deep blue and the stars came out, sharp and cold above the hills. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, the sound lonely but not mournful. Andrew took off his hat and set it on the step beside him, then reached for her hand. When the spring planting was done, he said, they would go back into town, not just for supplies, but to see the preacher and make this right in the eyes of everyone who still whispered. She looked at him a moment, her dark eyes steady, and then she nodded once, a small, certain gesture. When they went inside, she folded the quilt back on the bed and turned toward him. There was no hesitation in her movement, no trace of fear. He banked the fire low, turned down the lamp, and together they lay down side by side. The cabin was quiet, but not empty. The kind of quiet filled with the small sounds of life, the rustle of fabric, the steady warmth of another body nearby. As the weeks passed, the earth turned rich and dark under their hands, the rows of seedlings standing green against the soil. Andrew woke each morning with the sun, no longer dreading the day, but eager for it. He found himself thinking about the future, as he had not dared to in years, picturing a time when there would be more hands to help with the work, more voices filling the house. One morning, as the sun climbed over the ridge, he stood at the window and watched her move through the yard, her skirts brushing the damp earth, her hair loose in the breeze. The sight filled him with a quiet, steady gladness. The ranch that had once felt haunted now felt alive. The house was no longer a hollow place echoing with the past. It was theirs, built again from the ground, up by the work of their hands and the stubborn decision to stay. When he stepped out onto the porch, she looked back over her shoulder, her expression calm, her eyes soft. Andrew swung his legs off the step and went to join her, feeling the sun on his face, the cool breath of morning on his skin. The day stretched ahead, full of work and promise, and for the first time since he had returned, he was glad of it. The house was no longer silent. The land was no longer empty. The future was something he wanted to meet head on. Together, they would make it. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more powerful stories you won't want to miss. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.